Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining CRWDP for our fifth in our student new researcher webinar. Today we have Dr. Alexis Buettgen presenting on her PhD work from York University. She graduated from York in February 2018, and she is now working for a Canadian consumer-driven organization called the Canadian Centre for Disability Studies as a senior research officer. And now I'm going to hand it over to Alexis before I hand it over to Alexis to do the presentation, I wanted to say that we do have a question and answer period, but we're going to hold that until the end. But please feel free to use your icon at the bottom that says Q&A to write your question in advance if you'd like to do that. And then we will get to those questions and question and answers after. We also have a certificate of attendance for anybody who needs that. Please email them and let me know. I'd be happy to send that out. And I will hand it over now to Dr. Buettgen to present on her research, her PhD research.
Great, thanks Pam. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today to hear about my dissertation research entitled From the Standpoint of People with Disabilities, an Institutional Analysis of Work in the Nonprofit Sector. So this dissertation was part of my PhD in the Critical Disability Studies program at York University, which I completed back in February of this year, as Pam has mentioned. Much of my PhD work focused on work and employment and disability issues over the course of my time at York. Prior to starting my PhD, I also worked in social services, working in supported employment with people labeled with intellectual disabilities, supporting them to gain work in the community. And then when I was at York, I did some work internationally as well in India, Nepal, and Bangladesh to promote the right to work for folks with various disabilities in those countries as well. So over that time, I started to really question and wonder about issues related to disability and employment and how it was actually a solution to poverty or not, which was really the impetus for my going back to school to get a PhD, was to try to understand this profound and stubborn issue of poverty that we seem to be experiencing here in Canada, despite the wealth and resources that we have. So the project we are about to discuss for the next hour, I guess, stems from my concern about how the current economic and political environment influences the forms of employment available to people with disabilities, and a curiosity about how and why the nonprofit service providing sector can be a potential site for inclusive employment. So this institutional analysis critically investigated how 3 Ontario nonprofit service providing organizations provided inclusive employment opportunities by examining institutional documents and policies, the perspectives of organization staff responsible for such practices, and the everyday experiences of people with disabilities working in these organizations. Findings from this dissertation indicated that various reading practices of the Ontario Human Rights Code can contribute to the abstraction or the valued recognition of the subjectivities of employees' embodied experiences, and highlights how employment in the nonprofit sector, from the standpoint of people with disabilities, very much implies the enrichment, but also the sacrificing of one's individual being. So just a couple of definitions there. Non-profit service providing organizations, when I use that term, because the nonprofit sector is nonprofit service providing organizations, what I'm referring to are those organizations that provide some sort of human services or social services. So it would involve hiring employees that would actually be working directly with people in communities on various issues. So I just wanted to highlight that. And yeah, so I'll just give a quick overview of the presentation before I start advancing. I'll start with just a quick overview of a background of the issues that sort of drove the study, an overview of the research questions, my methodology, just a few of the key findings, and then wrap up with conclusion and implications from this. So I should also mention that the focus here on the nonprofit sector was also quite specific, because I found in my previous work that so much effort was going into looking at the corporate sector or the for-profit sector. And the nonprofit sector to me was quite important because it's human resource intensive and doesn't seem to be looked at as much in the literature. So in terms of background, as many of you might know, people with disabilities in Canada and around the world have fewer economic opportunities, higher rates of poverty, poorer health, and lower education than people without disabilities. The profound poverty of people with disabilities has been found to be both a cause and a consequence of exclusion from social, economic, legal, and political life. There's a number of ways in which this poverty is being addressed in policy, research, and practice. And some things include a reform of income support programs. So we're hearing a lot about that, especially here in Ontario right now with the new government that we have, and thinking about how to support people who maybe aren't engaged in the labor market or aren't earning an income from employment. So that's one way, is to start working on the income support programs. Another is to focus on asset and saving accumulation plans. So an example of this would be like the retirement, the RDSP, the Retired Disability Savings Plan, for example, tax-free savings accounts, that kind of thing. And, you know, increasing the amount of assets that people can hold before they're going to get sort of have their income support cut back in some way. There's also strategies to promote inclusion of disability in poverty reduction strategies at, you know, either the local or national, provincial, or international levels, and so on. So a number of different ways in which it's being addressed, but one particular way, we're going to seeing a lot of emphasis on this right now, is to increase the employment rate among people with disabilities. So there's a growing body of research on this subject within and beyond the field of critical disability studies, which was where I focused my research. However, most of this work is focused on employment in the for-profit sector and developing the business case for hiring people with disabilities. There's really a relative absence of research focused on employment opportunities in the nonprofit sector, which includes a significant part of the labor market. And it also includes organizations that are serving people with disabilities. So, you know, to me, when I was thinking about what I wanted to do for my doctoral research, this was important to me. If the sector is serving people with disabilities and promoting employment of people with disabilities, we need to also look inward to see how that sector is walking the talk, so to speak. So my research begins to address these issues and gaps and was guided by the following research questions. So my first question was, what strategies can be utilized to provide inclusive workplaces and positive images around disability and diversity in the nonprofit service providing sector? Secondly, I wanted to look at how do labor market policies in Ontario influence the potential of the nonprofit service providing sector to be an inclusive employer. So given the breadth of the nonprofit sector, which includes, you know, everything from small volunteer-run organizations that cover, you know, interests around arts and culture, human rights, education, healthcare, and so on, my study focused on the employment of people with disabilities in the subsector of nonprofit human service providing organizations in Ontario. And the subsector was selected because it's human resource intensive and because of its social agenda and potential for meaningful employment opportunities. The study also picks up on some interesting critiques of employment-focused solutions to poverty. Some critical disability studies scholars have argued that apparently progressive social policies appear to be engaging with disabled people's desires and aspirations for employment, while at the same time purposely ignoring the complex social aspects of disablement and employment. Some suggest that the problem with developments in social policy that promote employment of people with disabilities is that they focus upon disabled people as individual competitors in labor markets, premised upon an assumption of personal deficits. So there are a few authors who are beginning to engage in discussions of disability, work, and the broader political economy, but this analysis is really limited so far. But I found it provocative and offered a starting point for this work. So this was a critical study, meaning that it drew from a critical theoretical framework. So unlike many other studies on disability and employment, I drew from critical theory to examine the possibilities of employment as a potential solution to poverty and exclusion, as well as its limitations as a component of capitalism and neoliberalism. Critical theory is useful here, and I found it useful in the study, because it accounts for power relations that shape employment conditions. It also considers the unleashing of the potentiality of all human beings. It links theory and practice and engages in an immanent critique. So this was important, particularly in the field in which I was getting my PhD in critical disability studies. So my methodology was an institutional analysis that was used as an overarching ontological and methodological framework that drew from institutional ethnography, or IE, as an emancipatory, critical theoretical method of investigation. This really fit well within the field of critical disability studies. My methods involved a criterion-based purposive sampling strategy to recruit participants from 3 nonprofit service-providing organizations in Southern Ontario. 2 of these organizations were consumer-driven, meaning that they were governed by a majority of people with various disabilities and served people with disabilities. Those 2 organizations I referred to as Organization A and Organization B later on. And then I also looked at one organization that served people with and without disabilities, which I have named Organization C. So these organizations were selected because they either had formal recognition or a documented history of workplace diversity and inclusiveness. So they had received awards or been acknowledged as employing people with disabilities and apparently doing it well. My focus here was really on trying to understand how things were working well. There's been so much talk and emphasis on the challenges and barriers facing people with disabilities in employment that I thought, that's good to know that, but what do we know about how to do it right, and who's doing it well, and how do we start to think about generalizing that, or how can that be taken up in other places? So that was the purpose of that sampling strategy. I conducted a series of interviews. I talked to 9 employees with disabilities across all 3 organizations. I spoke with 6 senior leaders, including 2 human resource reps, 1 union representative, and 3 senior managers across the organizations. And it's very important here that I use pseudonyms to protect confidentiality and anonymity. As you can imagine, a number of people, including the organization representatives, were concerned about revealing a lot about their workplace experiences. Employees especially concerned about whether or not what they told me was going to get back to their coworkers or to their bosses or so on. So, you know, the confidentiality and anonymity piece was really important. It actually took quite a bit of time to recruit people and gain their trust to talk to me and to ensure that that they would be able to share information with me and that I would be trustworthy. So in addition to the interviews, I also did a textual analysis following the format of institutional ethnography. I looked at organizational documents such as HR policies and procedures, strategic plans, annual reports, accessibility policies, sample accommodation plans, and so on. And then also looked at relevant laws, policies, and legislation that informed those organizational documents. So my analysis looked at explicating how the institutional order created the conditions of individual experience for employees with disabilities. So I wanted to understand the culture. I wanted to understand how things worked and under what conditions and what environments. So drawing from institutional ethnography analysis, rigor came not from the techniques such as sampling or thematic analysis, but from developing a map of social relations, which I'll show you in a few minutes. Rigor also came from referring back to individual accounts and inviting participant feedback throughout the process. And particularly from the standpoint of employees with disabilities, that is where I started, and that is where I always went back to. I started with the transcripts of interviews with employees to find clues about how their experiences were socially organized within and beyond the workplace. And then I considered how their experiences were coordinated and influenced by various texts at the organizational and higher levels, and then how those were influenced by broader institutional processes. So now the interesting stuff, the findings. I'll just highlight a few of the key things here, and I'd be glad to answer questions at the end if you have any about them or want to know more. So what I found was that the concept of work was implicitly extended by employees and reflected what Dorothy Smith refers to as a generous concept of work. Dorothy Smith is a Canadian sociologist, I believe, feminist sociologist who developed institutional ethnography. So I drew a lot from her work to understand the study and to develop it. So specifically this chapter on the generous concept of work, of my findings related to the work of being disabled, emotion work, and the benefits of employing people with disabilities in the nonprofit service providing sector, which I will briefly speak to next. So employees with disabilities describe the mental, physical, and emotional work related to being disabled in the workplace. Similar to previous research on disability and employment in Ontario, I found that to varying degrees, employees internalized understandings of what constituted an appropriate performance in a work environment and normalized their own behavior accordingly. I found a connection of this to the neoliberal advancement of new public management and conceptual notions of productivity in the nonprofit sector. For example, Faith from Organization B said, "I tolerate a lot to get to work because of my disability. I try to be positive and cheery. I push myself maybe a little too much. I don't want my impairment winning. That's why I try to stay positive and fight it. Some days I'm completely wiped, but that's usually my evening, so I don't have a social life. I used to have hobbies in the community, and I had to give it up because I need to have my energy for work." Considerations of the work of being disabled was also closely linked to how emotion occurred in the workplace. At Organization C, Elizabeth told me that she expressed emotions of sadness in the workplace, but only in the safe base of her supervisor's office. So Elizabeth said, "I can go into that office," pointing to her supervisor's office next door, "and cry some days. It's the kind of thing where it's embarrassing to cry, but I'm a very sensitive person and I know it's okay in there." And she told me one day that she talked to another supervisor who said they don't keep Kleenex in their office because, it's like you're a professional and you're paid to be here, not cry in the office. But I feel like when I'm here, I'm on and I get the work done. And she, my supervisor, knows that my work is as quality as anybody else's and that I carry my weight. So to explain how and why the nonprofit service providing sector can be a potential site for inclusive employment, this study included employees and senior leaders who talked about the benefits of employing people with disabilities in their organizations. According to senior leaders, employing people with disabilities also employed their knowledge, experiences, interests, and perspectives in the work of the organization. Employment opened up the opportunity for disability to become part of the systematic knowledge and techniques of the profession. From an employee's perspective, Katie said, "Everyone at Organization A is really passionate and committed to their work. Most of the employees have a disability, and I think it makes a difference in the way services are delivered and people's perception of disability, because we don't act like social workers. We don't look at people like they're just a case file and just make a list or a plan of action and then check them off the list. We understand a little bit more of the intricacies of negotiating life with a disability, and we don't get caught up in the minutiae." So in addition to that, previous research also indicates that workplace accommodations can enable the participation of employees with disabilities. So I really looked and honed in on this particular process because it was highlighted so often time and again by the employees that I spoke with, and then also, the other senior leaders and HR reps and so on at the organizations. All participating employees that took part in the study used some form of accommodation to do their jobs. And while all three organizations followed a similar process, guided by the same governing text, which was the Ontario Human Rights Code, the social organization of their accommodation processes were notably different. So I'm just going to go through a few images for you, and I'll go through them verbally so that in case it's not accessible to you, I'll explain it all. So first, I found the accommodation process followed 4 general steps taken by all 3 employers to provide accommodations for their employees. So this process involved first recognizing the need for accommodation, which was either requested by an employee or identified by the employer as something that was needed. The second step involved gathering relevant information and assessing needs. So the employee is an active participant in this step. The employer may ask for medical documentation, and the employer and employee explore accommodation options. The third step involved writing some sort of formal accommodation plan. Accommodation details are written down in an individual plan that is signed and approved by the employer and the employee. This plan looked different at different organizations. Some were more formal, some were more informal, but it involved some sort of documentation of a plan. The fourth step involved implementing, monitoring, and reviewing the accommodation, where the employer and the employee monitor accommodation to ensure needs have been met. Formal reviews are conducted at predetermined intervals. The accommodation plan is reviewed if the employee's work location or position changes. And the accommodation is reviewed if the nature of the employee's disability changes. And all of this sort of cycles around so that, if the accommodation is no longer appropriate, it goes back to the first step in terms of recognizing the need for accommodation. So I should note that this was, this image I drew from an image that was in a document created by the Conference Board of Canada on workplace accommodation. I didn't design it myself. I modified it and adapted it for what I heard from employees, but I found that this process, as highlighted by the Conference Board of Canada, really stood out as something that was occurring in each workplace. And that was probably because that document and this image was drawn from steps that are outlined in the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So next, I'll go through the map of social relations that I created at for each organization based on what I heard from folks. And I should also tell you that I did share all of these findings back, the draft and the final version, with all of the people who took part in the study and the organizations to ensure accuracy and make sure that my interpretation was correct. So made a few minor adjustments as need be, but this generally seemed to resonate with them as well. So we'll start with organization A, which, as I mentioned, is a consumer-driven organization, relatively small, less than 50 employees. And they followed a fairly informal process out of all 3. So what I have here is the employee on the outside of this rectangular box enters into the accommodation process. And it begins when the employee makes an accommodation request to the direct manager, usually, unless it comes through conversation that's initiated by the employer or the manager of some sort. When that request is made, then the employee waits for a response. As the employee is waiting for a response, at this point, the organization activates their human resource policy, which means that the manager then forwards the accommodation request to the executive director. The executive director then makes a decision about the suitability of the request based on the needs of the employee and the needs of the organization. And then the employee is brought back into the process to meet with the executive director and the manager to discuss and complete an accommodation agreement. At this time, once they come to an agreement, then the employee receives their accommodation in accordance with the emailed accommodation agreement. So they didn't have necessarily a formal template or a formal document that they would complete for this plan, but it would be via email that they would communicate these things, and it would be subject to change depending on the needs of the employee or their position and so on. It was relatively informal, a lot of conversation-based stuff. So the employees that I heard from really liked this. It seemed to work quite well. It was not very bureaucratic. Moving on to organization B. Somewhat similar to Organization A, consumer-driven organization, less than 50 employees, relatively small. Again, relatively informal process. So the employee enters into the accommodation process, again, when they make an accommodation request to their supervisor, the HR manager, or the executive director. Or this communication could be initiated by the supervisor, HR manager, or executive director. At that point, the employee then waits for a response. The organization then activates an accommodation policy that they have in place. And the HR manager and the executive director draft an accommodation plan using an accommodation plan template. After which, the employee is brought back in to meet with the HR manager and the executive director to complete the accommodation. So it's important to note that the HR manager and the executive director just draft the plan and then to discuss it with the employee, and will negotiate depending on how the needs of the employee and the position in the organization about the final plan, which of course is subject to change depending on the needs of everyone. They agree on this, the employee then receives the accommodation in accordance with the accommodation plan. So that's Organization B. Organization C, if you can see it, is a bit more complicated and many more steps. So Organization C was not consumer driven, a much larger organization of over 900 employees. So they had a much more formal process that they followed in terms of implementing accommodations in the workplace. So like Organization A and B, the employee entered the accommodation process when they made an accommodation request to their supervisor, HR, or union representative. At that point, the employee then waited for a response. When this request was made, it always ended up getting forwarded to HR, and they activated the accommodation and return to work policy. This request was then shared with a disability management consultant that they bring in whenever an accommodation request is made or an accommodation plan is required. It's an external disability management consultant that comes in. At this point, the employee is brought back into the process and receives a request from the disability management consultant for medical documentation as proof of their disability. They are required to submit this documentation to the disability management consultant, and the information must be completed using a functional abilities form that the organization has developed and requires really specific information from the doctor. Once this form is submitted, then the employee waits for a response. And that information request is sent to the doctor. The doctor sends it back to the HR and disability management consultant who receive this information, and they consider the medical documentation as to whether or not it is appropriate for their needs to determine the accommodation. If not, they'll send it back to the doctor and ask for different information. So this involves a job demands analysis document that they activate to look at the demands of the job and the functional abilities of the employee to try and determine an accommodation plan. So the HR and disability management consultant draft an accommodation plan using an accommodation plan template, which then is sent to the employee, and a meeting is held. So the employee is brought back into the process where they meet with the disability management consultant, the an HR rep, a union representative, and their supervisor, and potentially a new supervisor, to complete an accommodation plan. This again is a negotiation back and forth a little bit, and then eventually the employee receives an accommodation in accordance with the accommodation plan. So that is that process. All of this, like I said, each of these processes, despite their differences, all reference the Ontario Human Rights Code as sort of the overarching governing text that help them determine what these processes would look like. So through further examination, I found that each organization drew from this text of the Ontario Human Rights Code, which presents standard guidelines that can be treated as there for everyone in the same way. However, I found that participants' readings, so the organization's readings in particular, of certain features within the Ontario Human Rights Code really coordinated how the accommodation process went forward. So it was interesting to me that despite the fact that they were all using the Ontario Human Rights Code, these processes look so different in each place. And I wanted to know why. So when I looked at that, I started to look at how they were interpreting the code. So at Organization C, for example, their reading of the code centered on aspects of the essential duties of a job and the use of medical documentation as the primary basis for the organization to plan and implement accommodations. Jamie, an HR rep at Organization C, described how the organization relied on these features of the code as representing the actualities of what the organization knew about the needs of individual employees. So in this way, when an employee enters the accommodation process at Organization C, they become an abstraction through the work of those who reconstruct the employee's life as a case history or a set of functional limitations, which I found effectively detaches employees from the experience of disability, from their histories, their perspectives, their capacities, their interests, their concerns, and their potentialities, because the organization is looking at documents about the individual and not necessarily speaking directly with the individual about their experiences. It really doesn't provide space for consideration of the deep anxieties of job loss or diminished social and work status that can foster experiences of being subjected to such assessments. And that really may be critical to an employment outcome without giving the employee a clear idea of what is involved in passing this assessment successfully. So that the gathering of medical documentation and this sort of process that occurred at Organization C really seemed to create some anxiety with the employees that I spoke with. On the other hand, representatives from Organization A and B spoke about how they avoided the use of medical documentation in their accommodation processes and instead focused on how they structured the workplace to include diverse workers. So they took a bit more of a proactive approach. They tried to notice when somebody might need a bit of an accommodation. Even if somebody hadn't self-identified with a disability, they tried to think about ways in which they could make the environment welcoming and inclusive. The acknowledgement of medical documentation in the accommodation process displayed recognition of the availability of this feature of the code. So representatives from Organization A and B knew that they could ask for medical documentation legally, but they didn't and chose not to ever because they just wanted to have a conversation with their employees that they were working with. So the fact that Organization A and B had not requested this documentation was an expression of their recognition of employees' subjective bodily experiences. Taking the word of the employee as evidence of their need for accommodation demonstrated trust. The final analysis of the accommodation process under the code found that this process ultimately focuses on the employee's ability to perform a useful and productive job for the employer, which emulates features of the capitalist relations of production. Similarly, a few employees spoke about how they limited their request for accommodation over concern about how their productivity would be perceived and to avoid rejection based on concern about their organization's financial hardship analysis, so the undue hardship clause, for example. Some of this was sort of alluded to in the quote that I mentioned earlier from Faith, who really sort of put on a bit of a happy and cheery demeanor at work to really not to sort of minimize the appearance of her disability or impairment. So in conclusion, my findings highlighted the complexity of the accommodation process increased when trying to fit individuals' limitations into organizational processes, as opposed to changing the workplace to better suit the need of the diversity of workers. It also brought attention to the lines of fault in institutional ethnography language, or a mismatch between the accommodation needs of disabled workers and the institutional processes developed to meet those needs. So my dissertation argues for the transformation of the workplace rather than the transformation of individuals to try to fit into environments that really weren't designed for them. This transformation should begin from individuals' subjective, everyday experiences at work, whereby work is understood to account for all the things that people do that require some effort to maintain employment. The nonprofit sector, I believe, is a potential site for inclusive employment. Because historically the views of people with disabilities have been filtered through the voices of non-disabled service providers, other professionals working in the area of disability, and family members. The study also indicates that organizations with a significant number of staff with disabilities can assist people with disabilities to have a voice of their own, identify their own needs, express views and priorities, critically evaluate service provision, and advocate for change and public awareness. And then just a quick note about some of the contributions of this work to particularly the field of critical disability studies. I contributed to an evolving theoretical conceptualization of disability and employment as the field of critical disability studies moves toward a greater consideration of human rights. And I think this needs to be looked at critically in terms of how human rights are interpreted and applied in practice. Using a generous concept of work, the study examined how rights operate in practice and how the code can impact the everyday experiences of people with disabilities at work. On a practical note, the study presents examples of how employees with disabilities have represented the image of social worker and disability. In terms of policy, I've shared critical analyses of the helpfulness and the limitations of the code, as well as other legislative tools that are intended to promote employment of people with disabilities. And for research, I offer an adaptable methodology for consideration of the challenges and the opportunities for the employment of people with disabilities in the broader nonprofit sector, as well as other geographic locations in Ontario, Canada, or internationally. And considerations to narrow the focus to specific groups of people might be valuable for future research, including people from various social locations, or extended to consider the everyday experiences of people working in organizations with a higher degree of precarious employment, for example. So in terms of next steps, I think there's a need to continue to critically examine the various ways of knowing and strategies of resistance in the context of the changing nature of employment. I also think there's a need to develop conceptualizations and practical applications of intersectionality in the workplace, and to consider the development of a model of inclusive employment drawing from the principles of inclusive design, which go a bit further than the notion of universal design, which is sort of a one-size-fits-all approach. Inclusive design is more of a one-size-fits-one type of approach, which was taken up more so at organization A and B. So that is all. Thank you so much for listening. I'll pause now to see if there are any questions that I can answer, and my contact information is up on the screen for you in case you have any further questions after today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buettgen. You have, from my perspective, made a really valuable contribution, because you're right. We look at, when we look at employment for disabilities at all, we look at employment in the for-profit, business world. So looking at it from a nonprofit standpoint is really interesting. And actually, a lot of questions were percolating while you were presenting, and apparently also for the attendees, because we have 5 questions to start with. So I will start with Margaret's question. Actually, she has 4 questions. So her first question is, first of all, great presentation, Alexis. You mentioned early on that some disability studies scholars have critiqued the notion of people with disabilities as having deficits that impede their competitiveness in the labor market. Can you tell us their names or give us citations?
Yeah, I can. Off the top of my head, that's a test. It was a little while ago. There's Grover and Piggott was one. Let me just see here. There's a few. I'd be happy to share if you want to email me. I can send some of those your way if you would like. If you're looking for specific citations on them, unless you wanted me to speak more so to the comments that they made.
Okay, if Margaret wants more information, she can certainly contact Alexis. Her email is there. And Margaret, if that's not what you're looking for, please let us know in the question and answer box. I am going to actually go down just to get a couple more different people, and then I'll go back to Margaret's. Dana asks, is your thesis available online?
Yes, it is. It is publicly available because it's a dissertation. So I think if you Google my name and or the title of the dissertation, then that will come up. But if you'd like, you can email me and I'd be glad to send it to you as well. But it is publicly available. It's a long document so far. I haven't published it in a shorter, more readable version, but it's there. The whole 250 pages of it.
Yep, that is long.
Yeah.
So Andrew asks, he says, "Hi, Alexis, that was great. Just a question about your participants. Was there a mix of gender representation? Any notable differences between experiences along the gender lines?"
Yeah, so this was something that I identified as something to be looked at for future research. I did not look at gender as a factor in this study because I was looking upwards to the institutional processes that determine people's experiences. And I didn't ask people about the gender that they identified with. Most of participants did appear to be female, but I didn't ask or probe into that in any way. So, I mean, the other thing about the nonprofit sector, and I think something that would be interesting to look at in future research and has been looked at, not necessarily in relation to disability, though, is the gender divisions within this particular sector and how it seems to be primarily female oriented. And there's been criticisms about the sector as being lower paid, more precarious, and so on, and that's been critiqued by feminist scholars in that particular way. So it's something that could be looked at. I think there's many ways in which to look at this from an intersectional approach, considering other issues related to gender, race or ethnicity, LGBTQ plus status, and so on, indigeneity as well, other factors that could be taken up. So, but no, that was not something that was examined in this one.
Okay. I will go back to Margaret, and she wants to know, do they offer alternatives to the deficit model for describing people with disabilities seeking employment?
Do they offer?
I think I think Margaret is referring to the nonprofit sector, or maybe is there an alternative model other than the deficit model for describing people with disabilities?
Well, I think this study highlighted some of that, particularly in some of the discussions amongst around the benefits of employing people with disabilities. So some employees and other organizational representatives talked about the benefits of employing with people with disabilities in this particular sector, because it so often views people with disabilities as service users rather than service providers. So I think that in that way, it looks at disability as an asset, and in that some employees with disabilities might provide unique insights from their own lived experiences on the experiences of service users as well, and particularly experiences with marginalization or oppression or prejudice and so on, and getting that. So the authors that I have cited, they, mostly what they do is critique as opposed to offer up a solution, which was one of my frustrations and something that I wanted to look at with this study and start to allude to in the dissertation is that looking, focusing on just the potential benefits of disability in the workplace, what it brings to the workplace itself and to the work that is produced.
Right. Okay, thank you. I'm going to go down to the bottom of our list, and Dana has another question. Did any of the participants talk about accommodations outside the workplace, whether it was requested, attempted, or successful, that enhanced their ability to work or to get work? For example, transportation.
We didn't really get into too much of that. Like, we didn't touch on employment services. In terms of transportation, some folks, a few, talked about how their employer, particularly at Organization A, allowed them to flex their work schedule so that they would be able to consistently book accessible transportation to and from work, because some of you might know that usually the paratransit systems are fairly rigid. They don't really usually flex very easily to people's schedules if they change. So the Organization A would make sure that people were out of work on time and able to get their rides and work from home if there were still tasks that were required, and or be able to come into work a little bit earlier or leave a little bit later or change up those start and end times in order to avoid rush hour traffic, particularly for somebody who might have like an environmental sensitivity or chemical sensitivity syndrome and doesn't want to be on a really busy bus or train or so on. So there were those kinds of accommodations in order to support people to deal with the transportation systems that were in place. But more so what I heard, which stood out more, was that people used a lot of their energy to get to and from work, to be at work, to be on, to be positive, to minimize the impacts of their disability on their work, despite how welcoming and inclusive the environment was. And so by the end of the day, they were essentially wiped out and tired and exhausted. So weren't able to engage in a lot of the same activities that they used to before. So accommodations that way weren't really talked about in the same respect, which is what made me sort of think about, just the nature of work itself as a bit problematic to being inclusive for people with disabilities, and how, questioning whether or not that's, was really worth it for some people. For obviously the folks that I talked to, it was worth it to expend that energy to get and keep a job. But for others, I think it's important that we think about that, particularly around the quality of employment. So I know I detracted a little bit from there, so I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. I will go down now to ask another question. One participant mentioned that she saves all her energy for work. Actually, this is a good segue from what you had just finished saying about, whether work is important or, whether it's worth it or not. So she's given up her hobbies. Did any participants have family responsibilities, and how did those affect their ability to work?
Yeah, several did have family responsibilities. They were parents, for example, so either single parents or they were in a two-parent family. So in that case, this sort of what made me think a little bit about universal design and inclusive design. So some of the best workplaces and situations that I heard about, particularly at organization A again, was that one participant said, when they were hired, they were asked if they needed any accommodations to do their job. They had not self-identified as a disability. It was just a standard question that was asked. And they said, well, not really around my disability necessarily, but more so because of my parenting responsibilities. I need to be able to go and pick up my child by, say, 5 o'clock. Otherwise, I'm going to get charged late fees for them being late at daycare. So their employer was very supportive in terms of making sure that their schedule suited that need to be able to also perform their parenting responsibilities and caregiving responsibilities. So that in that case, it really sort of broadened. And what I found really interesting of these organizations was that accommodation was not just about disability. It was about accommodating people for their everyday lives and their experiences, whether it was about caregiving or parenting or any other sort of sickness or illness or personal time or, just life, because they recognized that, they hired people to do a job as workers, but that they also had a life beyond that, and trying to help people find as much as of a balance, so to speak, of between work and life. So providing those kinds of accommodations to make sure that their workers were happy, that they were able to meet their other needs and interest in life and that kind of thing. So,
right. So actually that question and your answer prompted me to go back to one of your slides the last slide that talked about inclusive design. Does that inclusive design take into consideration accommodation for life as opposed to accommodation for just disabilities?
Yeah, so inclusive design, this concept actually I drew from at OCAD University, the Inclusive Design Research Center. It's a concept that was developed particularly for the digital realm, but I found kind of useful in considering the findings from this study. So inclusive design, what what it is intended for. I don't know if it's so much for life, because the idea is that it's impermanent in a way, right? Like, so it goes beyond universal design in terms of thinking about, not even necessarily the need for accommodation, but developing strategies and inclusivity based on the needs of each individual, and thinking about each person's individual circumstances. So I think it's important, particularly when looking at this map of social relations between organization A, B, and C. Organization A and B were much more informal and flexible in terms of how they developed their accommodations, and it was whether it was about disability and other needs or not. But Organization C had a much more rigid, much more formal process, which was much more, it was universal design in that it was available and there for everyone, but effectively didn't really always suit the needs of everybody, even though it was designed the same way. So inclusive design is more of a one size fits one. It's taking each person's individual case and circumstances and thinking about that in order to meet their interests and their needs. So it's building more so from like people's own subjective embodied experiences of disabilities and working from there, as opposed to a more top-down approach.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that concept. So were there any participants that were denied accommodations? And if so, was there an appeal process in place to address that?
At Organization C, there were some employees that were not entirely satisfied with the accommodation that they had in place for them. But they didn't really have a choice in the matter to the extent that they thought that they should, because the decision for the accommodation was based on medical documentation and the functional abilities form. So because it was a much more bureaucratic, sort of paper-based type of decision, it wasn't really necessarily always suitable to folks. So I remember there was one participant in particular who was placed into a department where they weren't doing frontline work anymore, but it was a relatively toxic department that they were put into, not very accepting of people with disabilities, a lot of infighting, a lot of conflict and that kind of thing. And this employee wanted to move and wanted it to be dealt with. She effectively said she was being bullied in the workplace, took it to her supervisor, took it to the union representative and so on to try and look for a change because it was making her feel worse. But nothing was really done about it. Nothing was changed because the accommodation plan set out that, there was to be no frontline work done, and this was the only other position that was available, and that was that kind of thing. So just a bit of inflexibility around those things. But all the employees, they were accommodated in one way or another, just some were more satisfied than others with what that accommodation looked like.
Right. And did you see a divide between the organizations about in regards to who was satisfied and who wasn't?
Yeah, there was differences, I would say, between organization A and B, where most people were pretty happy. Organization C, where I found a bit more dissatisfaction, but it was a small sample. So, I wouldn't want to say that that was the situation across the board. It's just that I could see that it was a bit more problematic at Organization C, given the bureaucratic nature of the process and given the use of medical documentation standing in for the experiences of the employees with disabilities themselves.
Right. And so did you have recommendations then that came out of those findings?
Yeah, so I think some of it I kind of mentioned in the conclusions and implications. So really, looking at the need to change the nature of work itself, transforming the workplace rather than the person. If there's this big push right now, we hear all the time in the news and in policy and so on that, we got to get people with disabilities in the jobs and we got to get the workplace to be, hire, diverse workers and so on. But workplaces effectively were not designed to be inclusive. You know, they were designed for a much different purpose in terms of making money, right, and getting the most out of workers, and getting the most productivity, right, and looking at workers just as workers, not necessarily as people. So if we're going to be moving more towards this idea of diversity and inclusiveness in the workplace and trying to get people off of social assistance and into work, then I think the need really is around looking at the workplace and the culture,
Right.
the environment, rather than changing and modifying the person to try to fit them into an environment that wasn't meant for them, I think is one of the key points there. And really just valuing and trusting and acknowledging people's subjective experiences of disability or otherwise in life, right? And as opposed to, you know, immediately stopping that conversation and bringing in outside consultants and paperwork and so on and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
And were you surprised that the nonprofit sector had the same sort of drive for productivity and looking at their worker as a worker that the for-profit world does? Or were you expecting something different?
No, not well. No, I coming from critical disability studies, I mean, it's critical, right, of a lot of things. And so, you know, as I was developing the study, that was something that was raised in particular by my committee is, you know, what differences are you going to actually find in the nonprofit versus the for-profit? You know, so I think it saddened me still to sort of have that, like something that I knew sort of reinforced in that way, that the nonprofit is being sort of developed and functioning in a much more business model than maybe it was originally designed to do. But in doing research there, you know, on the history and how the sector has been pulled into this kind of mode of operation and this focus on dollars and cents over and above the quality of services and employment has been something that's been kind of occurring over the last few decades, and it coincides with the rise of neoliberalism and cutbacks and all that sort of stuff. So, I mean, when you think about, I've done a lot of work with various nonprofits and worked in the nonprofit sector quite a bit throughout my life so far. So, you know, a lot of it comes down to applying for grants and trying to get funding and finding your niche and surviving and keeping the organization afloat versus, you know, decades ago when organizations used to get some sort of core operational funding and they would be able to work within that budget and provide the services that were needed according to the needs of service users.
Right. That's actually a very good point. Thank you. That, you know, the competitiveness has really kind of forced them to run within a business model.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, most grant applications, even, you know, for research too, you have to, you know, it comes down to expenses and the budget and that kind of thing too. So, yeah.
So I have one last question before we end, because I know we're almost out of time, but were there any surprises in your finding that, you know, did you go in with assumptions, and once the research was done, were there any surprises for you?
For me, I guess when I had studied human rights, it's sort of talked about as this great model, the human rights model of disability and promoting the rights of people with disabilities and so on. So it was a bit surprising to me to see how the Ontario Human Rights Code, which is sort of heralded as this wonderful document, can really be leveraged and used in a way that didn't really always promote the best kind of life for folks, you know, and how it can be manipulated and read in different ways. So I found that really interesting. You know, but I don't know if I was necessarily surprised but it was interesting to me. The other thing that I kind of found really interesting was just how much I found bureaucracy to be at odds with the effective inclusive accommodations of people with disabilities in the workplace.
Right.
Those are two things.
And I did say one question, but this is just so fascinating. I have to ask this, but if you don't have the time, you know, we can discuss it another time. But inclusive design, is anybody working on that?
Yeah, it's something, I mean, definitely in the digital realm, and I'd be glad to share information about that and the link to more information about it. It is being taken up, but not in this particular area. So I think it's something that is interesting and should be looked at because there's so much talk about universal design, but thinking about inclusive design in other contexts beyond just the digital realm, I think is really interesting. It was extremely beneficial from what I could find at organization A and B. So it's definitely an area that needs further exploration, but not really taken up in the world of work and work disability policy just yet.
Okay, well, I think that might be something that we can put on the work disability policy agenda.
Yeah,
We'll certainly keep it in mind. Alexis, thank you so much. I really learned a lot, and I hope our attendees learned as much as I did, and I think it was a great use of time. I really appreciate it, and thank you so much for giving your time today to present your findings.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.